I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over. And Omar El Akkad has been on my radar since 2017 and American War came out. And we're seeing sort of a resurgence in sales for this dystopian novel set in the US in, well, let's call it the edge of this century, beginning of next. And he followed it with another novel called What Strange Paradise in 2020, 2021. We were trying to remember before we started taping. And of course, it was that weird moment in world history where everything kind of blurs together. And now we also have an essay collection. One day, everyone will have been against this. And we're going to sit down and actually have sort of a body of work conversation because Omar's worked as a journalist. He's now written novels. He's also obviously working as an essayist. And there's a lot of overlap, but also, well, you know, we are talking different genres. And I am really excited to have this conversation with you, Omar. Thank you so much for making the time.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So I want to go back to American War because I remember when I got a galley, Sonny Maida dropped it in the mail to me because, you know, I'm one of those booksellers where occasionally you would get mail from Sonny Maida, and it was really exciting because he was the head of Knopf and he had great taste, and you were like, oh, what is this? And I tore through it in a weekend. And then I was kind of like, well, who's this guy writing this book set in an America I don't quite recognize, but could happen, featuring this young woman who I adore, but then does a thing where I'm like, There was a lot of And I want to go back. You were still working as a journalist, I think, full-time when you were writing American War, yeah?
I was, yeah. I'd been working for the better part of a decade. I mean, that job I had at this newspaper in Canada is the only real job I've ever had. I've been otherwise unemployed.
Do we call it unemployed? I mean, you've been writing books. That's not technical unemployment, my friend. What is going on here? What are we talking about?
I feel like if you're not getting a set paycheck every other Friday, then you have some claim to the term unemployed. But yeah, I mean, I'd written 3 novels during my time as a journalist. I wrote them in my spare time.
Oh.
And they were horrible, and they'll never see the light of day.
Okay.
And then I wrote American War, and American War was also going to sit on my hard drive until I had a bad day at work. I had a day where I felt like I was just rewriting press releases.
Right.
And so I shipped it off to a literary agent. She decided to represent me, and 3 months later, you know, she sent the manuscript to Sonny right away. It was sort of, for obvious reasons, her first choice. And we heard nothing for 3 months, and then we get an email that just says, I like it, or something like that.
Yeah.
Because that's how Sonny functions. He was not a man of many words. And we sold it in the fall of 2015, I guess it was.
Okay, so 2015, pubbed in March of 17, if I remember.
April,
okay. So 2017, though, so it's 2 years before it sees the light of day, which makes me feel like there'd been some rewrite. I mean, you are a Canadian. You do decide to set this novel in the American South. We're looking at a world where climate change is very, very real, where there has been a literal civil war. There is a refugee camp of the kind that we have read about overseas, but not experienced necessarily in the US. All of these elements, and I feel like part of it has come out of your journalism, but also part of it just comes out of asking questions that maybe an insider wouldn't, like, you kind of have the ultimate outsider experience, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, I had started writing this thing, and I knew in an abstract sense what I was writing about.
Right.
But nothing more than that. And at the time, I was working as a U.S. correspondent for a non-U.S. paper.
Right.
And so, but it wasn't like my paper was on the other side of the planet. It was in Canada. So it was a very weird sort of like distance, because at once it's very close, but also very far away. In journalism, we have this phrase called M-copy. And M-copy is basically the background paragraphs that you put in a story just to explain how we got to this place. And when you're writing about the US for a Canadian audience, a lot of the M-copy just boils down to like, no, this is how it works down here. Like that really, you know, like healthcare stories, gun violence stories. And so I was in that mode of assessing the place that I was now living in. But yeah, I had been bugging the foreign editor to let me go down to Louisiana and do a story about land loss in southern Louisiana. It's the site of one of the worst climate change disasters on the continent. And it was only when I got there that I realized I needed to start this book here. Because my central trick as a writer is not particularly clever, it's inversion. I take things that are headed this way and I make them go that way. And in a book that's so concerned with things that the United States had done to the world, it felt fitting to start it in a place where the world was doing something to the United States. So that's how that sort of came about. And then following that, there were so many trips to the southern states, either for research or for other assignments. And that's how I sort of ended up getting the topography that I warp to such a grotesque extent in the novel.
But that inversion, I mean, I remember when American War hit my desk and I was thinking, everything goes in phases, right? All novels, we're having a dystopian moment. You can say it's related to the Hunger Games. You can say it's related to The Handmaid's Tale. You can say it's related to any number of things. We're selling 1984 again, And it's really kind of fascinating as a bookseller to see all of these things come back through. But if I think back to 2017, American War really did stand out. We were having kind of a moment where it was like, oh, wait a minute. Why, what? Okay. We're fast forwarding ahead a century. We've got this sort of unnamed narrator who's explaining to us that really wild, terrible things have happened. There's been a plague. There's been a separation. He's been sent to exile in Alaska and become a historian as a result of all of this. And I remember thinking, okay, I'm in, but where are we going and what's happening? And then you give us this cast, this family. And I really want to start with them because I had not quite met a family like this before. And I think you might not have in the earlier books that are sitting in a drawer somewhere that will never see the light of day.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I would find time and time again in this part of the world, and particularly when I would go to the South, is that I would meet a certain kind of person. I would meet a person who was incredibly hospitable, would give you the shirt off their backs, but also tied to some really stubborn traditions. Some of them good, some of them horrible, and God help you if you try to dissuade them from any of it. And honestly, it reminded me of the old country. It reminded me of growing up in the Arab world, where this sense of hospitality is greater than I've ever seen it anywhere else in the world. Also, there's some really old traditions, some of them good, some of them horrible, and God help you if you try to argue against any of it. And so this family comes out of this strange sense of echoes in terms of who I'd grown up with, who I was seeing now. Looking back on it, I think I was interested in the family dynamic because I think of a family dynamic as a proxy for trust. What are your circles of trust? What do they look like? And to me, a lot of this novel is about the central character's circle of trust. When we first meet Sarat Chestnut, she's a small child, and her circle of trust is endless. She hasn't been damaged in such a way as to change that. She believes everything everyone tells her about the world, and it just so happens that for the first part of her life, like many children, everyone is her family. Her family is the entirety of the universe. It's the star she orbits. And then as she grows older and as she's subjected to these injustices, as she has to live through the aftermath of a war, every new piece of damage shrinks that circle of trust until finally it only encompasses her sense of revenge. That's the only thing she can trust anymore. And even that is shaky towards the end. So that's how I was thinking about that family when I first sort of started writing them. And then they went off in their own directions, and particularly the relationship between the two sisters. And then much later on, the relationship between the brother and the sister. All of those things, I mean, it's the reason you write, is for that serendipity value where the characters get up and tell you, no, you have no idea what the hell you're talking about. We need to go in this direction. And that's a lot of what happened there.
If I remember correctly, too, there was quite a lot of rewriting that happened with American War. There was a lot of structural change. And can we talk about that for a second? Because this book is so seamless. And I'm rereading it recently, and it had been a number of years, obviously, since I'd read it. But it was familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. The pacing is really terrific. And it's also very, obviously, it's very disconcerting. There are moments where I'm just like, okay. I'm in, I'm here. But at the same time, I hadn't remembered every detail. So there was quite a lot that felt like I was reading it for the first time. But I want to just talk about structuring, because you're cutting back and forth between time. You're also cutting back and forth between place. There has to be an internal map for you.
There was an external map for me. I drew maps of the central locations that this book takes place in. In fact, at the time, I had this giant wall map of the U.S. that I had sort of shaded in on my wall, and it looks similar to the map that you first see when you open the book. And what I didn't realize for a very long time is, at the time I was still working as a journalist, and we would do these video hits where I would sit on my computer, and the way the computer was facing, you could see the map in the background.
Oh.
And so there's these videos on my newspaper's website where it's just me talking, and behind me there's a map with a bunch of post-it notes that say like suicide bombing here or whatever. And it's not a great look. The in between the chapters in the book, there are these fake historical documents, letters from governors and transcripts of speeches. And originally I wasn't going to put that in the book. I was writing these things as a way to keep track of all the moving parts of this world, because I come from a journalism background. So I spent a lot of my time with documentation, with paperwork. And it was only after a few drafts that it occurred to me that, or maybe like later on in the writing process, it occurred to me that if I had inserted these into the text, they would give it an element of texture that I wouldn't be able to achieve with just a straightforward narrative. So the one I always go back to is the letter from the detainee at Sugarloaf, which is an internment camp that is very similar to, or prison camp, I suppose, that's very similar to Guantanamo Bay. And this thing has been censored, so when you look at it on the page, there's black lines everywhere. And when Dion Graham reads the audiobook, he just says redacted, redacted, redacted. And the funny thing about that is that Penguin Random House actually screwed up some of the redactions, and they accidentally unredacted some of the stuff. And I thought, this is so fitting, given my experience with governments and censorship, that we're going to keep it this way. So there's some accidentally unredacted stuff. But it was all, once it came in to the book, it felt like the book needed to be that. But early on, it was just a straightforward narrative, and I was just doing these things to keep track internally.
I'm really glad they're in there. I appreciate the external context, as it were. I mean, for me, it's world building, right? Like, we talk about world building constantly as something that belongs only to science fiction and fantasy and robots and outer space and all of this kind of thing. And obviously American War is a dystopian, and that gives you and it more leeway to be a complete world. But also it's very easy to get yanked out of a world. And I felt completely grounded. Even when I was uncomfortable, I felt completely grounded in this space, and I understood what it smelled like, and I understand what the people looked like, and how they were dressed, and how they were moving their bodies in space, how they were moving in the world. And I still didn't want to leave, but I still really needed to understand how we got there. And I mean, I read fiction to understand a larger context about time, sometimes space. Mostly time, mostly the passage of historical periods. So the idea that we can take this and, as you say, invert it and kick ourselves into the future and say, well, look where we got ourselves. And yet have it feel like, oh, I get this, I recognize this. This feels like Tuesday.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the central trick, again, is this kind of inversion, right? And so I was taking the things that had happened to people and are happening to people, and I was casting them in the heart of the empire. And so, I often say that if I'd written this book 100 years earlier, I would have had to call it British War, because the point wasn't to set it in the US, the point was to set it in the heart of the superpower. And it's funny because I can't generally go back and read my own writing. I don't. And so I haven't gone back to American War, and now it's been a decade since I wrote this thing. And it's interesting to me because I think it's the best story I've ever written. Like, I think What Strange Paradise on a line level, the sentences are better, but I think American War is a better story. But B, it's sort of when I think within Penguin Random House, when this book first shows up, and obviously they have no idea who the hell I am. My agent had sold Sonny one manuscript in 40 years. This was the second manuscript. So there's a sense of just like, who the hell is this guy? But there was also a sense of like, oh, this might be the next Hunger Games. Like, this thing might sell millions of copies. And obviously it never did that.
Right.
But what's interesting to me is that it never had this pop. Like, my new book showed up on the New York Times bestseller list
in a
first
week.
and we'll find out very shortly whether it drops off the face of the earth after that or not. American War never did that, but it also never kind of went away. There was always like this weird like trickle of relevancy because of the various derangements of this country echoing back to the book. And so to this day, it just kind of chugs along. It's sort of like that 1984 effect, but like many orders of magnitude less. Like where it's just like it doesn't not feel relevant to some facet of what's happening in this country.
I also got really attached to Sarat. I got really attached to her, and obviously her arc is her arc. And I wasn't surprised to be attached to her, but I'm dancing around spoilers as I always do, but I got really attached to her and I was really invested in seeing what happened. And again, I understand the art. It's all very organic. It is plain as day in many ways, but I did not want to let go of her. And I don't think anyone else in her orbit knew really what to do with her, though. I mean, she really, like, yes, I've seen comparisons sort of made to Katniss Everdeen from the Hunger Games, but Sarat's slightly different. There's a similar thread, obviously, but Sarat really is her own person. And to be that invested, for me, in a character like that is a mark of high praise. You've had to let that character go and let people decide what they were going to think and feel and respond to.
Yeah, I mean, I think more than any other character I've written in any of the novels or any of the short stories, she's the one who stays with me the most. I don't like her, but I love her dearly. I don't think that she would like me if we ever met. I was at this university book club with a bunch of professors. One of them started yelling at me for what she perceived as me trying to get people to sympathize with terrorists or something like that. And I found that fascinating just conceptually of what it said about this person's expectations of books and of storytelling in general. But first of all, I don't think there's anybody in American War, there's any character in that book that you can pledge some kind of allegiance to and not assume an immediate and somewhat crippling moral debt. And I think that's true of every moment of living through a conflict that I've ever witnessed in my life. This is what the ugliness of the world does to people generally. But Sarat, to me, I think is someone who by the end of her life has become a person that, in our way of thinking about the world, we would only think of at the finish line. And it was very, very important to me. In fact, it became the most important thing about this book, to show the rest of that race, to show how somebody ends up at that destination. And that became the thrust of the book for me, was to take this human being that when we first meet her is like any child you would meet, not possessed of that fundamental dishonesty of adulthood, right? And to take her through the world and show how she becomes the person she becomes. That ended up consuming me as in terms of the writing. And to this day, when I think of that book, I think of Sarat, and
Absolutely.
everything else is secondary.
Absolutely. I mean, I read a lot of fiction. I read a lot of novels. I love the interiority. I mean, there is no art form that matches quite, all respect to the screen arts. Love you guys too. But there really is no other art form that captures that change, that interiority, that path. And to see it happening and to understand what's happening and also not want to turn away is really, it's going to sound slightly ironic to say that's one of the great pleasures of reading, right? That you can make yourself feel uncomfortable, and yet it can still change you in fundamental way. I mean, in some cases, your heart can grow 3 sizes bigger. In some cases, you can simply say, I can't. And you put something down, and maybe you come back to it and maybe you don't. But the idea that we have access to these different characters and their, I mean, I have to say, when I met Gaines, I was like, this, no, can't get away from this dude fast enough. Cannot get away from this. Still makes my skin crawl. That is the one sort of reliable piece of I was like, oh, this guy again. This, and also the swamp and the watch. I was like, oh yeah, I didn't forget that part. You know what I'm talking about with the swamp. I'm just going to call it a swamp, but you and I know what Sarat did. Did writing this book change you, though? Did it change the way you think? Did it change the way you approach your craft?
I think it refocused a lot of my life up until that point.
What do you mean?
So a lot of the things that happen in that book are tethered to events that did happen, like in real life. So everything in the Camp Patience section of that book is based on Sabra and Shatia, a Palestinian refugee camp that was the site of a massacre some 40 years ago. Sabra is the Arabic word for patience. That's where that name comes from. But someone like Gaines, for example, this notion of the mentor, the recruiter, that kind of character is based on this case that in Canada that I spent 2 years covering called the Toronto 18 case, which was this big terrorism case where it was mostly these kids, like 18 years old, who were planning to, bomb Parliament Hill or whatever. But then there were a couple of older guys who had no plans of doing any of this stuff themselves, but were very much sort of like spiritual guidance folks. And those to me just seemed so much more insidious than anybody else involved in that case. And I think when I was done sort of living in the world of American war, that insidiousness and how much it shapes so many of the currents of the world, how much men like that end up shaping the current of the world, became much clearer to me as a result of having spent all that time in this invented world. I mean, you talk about interiority, the way I tend to think of, and I think we're thinking of the same subject here, but we're using different terms. I tend to think of it as retreat. I don't think anything like the novel handles retreat as well. Even film, TV, visual media, where you can physically show someone retreating, it doesn't do it as well, because in the novel, in that kind of storytelling form, the retreat into oneself, I think, can be dissected in ways that are, at least to my mind, more difficult in any other media. And so that's how I was kind of thinking about it. But on the other side of having written that book, obviously there are all kinds of pragmatic changes. I become a published author, I quit my job, all the rest of that stuff. But as a human being, I think I had to sit with certain uncomfortable bits of knowing about myself. The central one being that there's really nothing that I believe or espouse or claim to be that I don't think would change in an instant the second it's my neighborhood being bombed to the ground or my family being wiped off the face of the earth. And so, this obviously comes into play with my new book, even though that's nonfiction. But I can sit here and tell you that I'm a pacifist and I can believe all of that. But that's a real easy thing to say when I'm on the launching side of the bombs, not the receiving end. And American War, I think the process of writing that crystallized just how much of a privilege it is to believe yourself to be a certain kind of person, knowing full well that calamity or atrocity or cataclysm could change every facet of who you are in an instant.
And before we get to the new book, I want to use this to switch over, because there's something you said that made me think of What Strange Paradise, which is the second novel. And this idea of the sort of there's some supporting characters. It's a novel not just about migration and a young boy and the friendship he makes with a young girl on a Greek island, but there are supporting characters who would not be out of place in American War. And there's some smugglers. There's an older uncle. It's very situational, and they are of a piece. And yet, you have also said that What Strange Paradise takes a little bit from fairy tales and Peter Pan-esque stories. And I want to talk about the connection between those two pieces, because I feel like, in some ways, What Strange Paradise is an obvious follow-up to American War, and yet in other ways you're really trying to do something differently, and it's not just the sentence level. I mean, I don't necessarily disagree that story is more the focus of American War and sentences are more the focus of What Strange Paradise, but there's a parallel track happening between those two books, and I think, again, it comes back to the character and the characters, I should say. So can we start there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in terms of the meta context of that book, I think it would be disingenuous of me to not tell you and the listeners of this podcast that book, all the enthusiasm for American War, there was none of that for this book. I mean, I think we had 13 foreign editions of American War. I think 11 or 12 of those publishers passed on What Strange Paradise. I knew that my own publishers, with one exception, were not particularly enthused about this book. First of all, it wasn't set in the US, and so generally they didn't think it was going to sell as well because the market is the market. But also, the people who came to American War for the dystopian, world-building, futuristic, whatever you want to call it, aspects, that's not here. This is a much more sort of focused, conceptually and geographically focused book. And I think it was well on its way to sort of wrecking my career, or what little of a career I had, until we got very lucky with a really positive New York Times review, and then it won this award up in Canada, and that kind of changed the trajectory of that book. But again, I go back to my central trick, which is inversion, right? I wanted to take this comforting fairy tale that Westerners had been telling their kids for 100 years, and I wanted to invert it and use it to tell a different kind of story. And again, for me, what sort of resonates, the aftertaste of the book that stays with me, is always relative to the disconnect between what the characters believe themselves to be and what they really are. And so when I think of this book, which, the two central characters are children, those aren't the characters that stick out in my head. Colonel Kethros is the character that sticks out in my head, because he's a guy who is fully at war with himself. And will never admit it. Will never sort of address that. And that, I think, is a point of commonality of what these incredibly unjust, asymmetrical systems that we've allowed to control the world, what they do to people in terms of severing them from themselves, such that people can walk around, and myself included, and most people I know included, can walk around with this conception of self, while at the same time consciously or subconsciously being aware that there's the reality of themselves, and that those two people might have almost nothing to do with one another. That, I think, is what I end up writing about a lot, even if I don't know it at the time.
But the story of the other, right? I mean, this is something you do. And yes, it's, okay, let's call it a trope. For want of a better word, let's call other as trope, right? And I think in some ways it can make literature really exciting, and it can bring a new perspective. And in some ways, I sort of look at it and go, oh, right, we're still telling the story. Like, what actually defines other anymore, right? We live in a global society. We live in a global world. We can pass across borders in ways that we couldn't previously. I was doing an event actually the other night with Colum Tavine, and he was talking about, well, there was a point where you couldn't just get on a plane and go home to Ireland. Like, you just couldn't do it. And that is, I think we forget what air travel has done, and sort of how porous things have become for certain classes, right? When I read What Strange Paradise, and you cut before, there are the before chapters and the after chapters, and I think we can sort of stick to that without giving too much away, but flipping between that before and after, we're always in a hinge moment, right? Like we're meeting these kids and everything changes. And then there is actually no rest, right? These kids are always on the move. Everyone's always on the move. Everything is always changing. And this book is half the length of American War. And actually, I might argue that more happens in a way in What Strange Paradise than American War, because there's one moment where the children are in a cave, having a snack and trying to rest, but there is no rest in this book. It's a constant chase.
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a bit of sort of narrative trickery that I think contributes to that. For one thing, the before chapters are in past tense and the after chapters are in present tense. And so you create a kind of velocity that way, which is a little bit of smoke and mirrors. And I'm not going to sort of, like...
Omar, it's not just smoke and mirrors. It's actually very clever.
But again, like this is the process of putting these things together. Like when you really get into how the sausage is made, like, that book, which is half the length of American War,
right,
went through 8 drafts. And for the first 4 drafts, there was no before and after chapters. It was just one continuous narrative with a ton of flashbacks. And the pacing was shot.
Yeah, this is better. Okay, this is better.
So at one point, it occurred to me that I had this very Old Testament, New Testament thing with the Exodus from Egypt and the miraculous rebirth. And I tried to codify it, and that's where before and after come from. And so structurally, that solved a lot of problems for me. But I think one of the really fascinating things to me about this idea of otherness, right, of the suffering of the so-called other, is that I think I belong to a generation, both in terms of chronology, in terms of how old I am, but also a writing generation, a literary generation, where there is that transition from the default trope, and I think trope is the right word to use here, in terms of how you try to get someone to care about the suffering of the other. Because I show up in time to see the default trope of first they came for this, and then they came for this, and then they came for this, which is this notion that you should care because eventually it's going to be you on that boat trying to get somewhere safe or washed up on the shore. And I think this has to do with this notion of how we perceive distance. So when you talk about this idea of like, there didn't always used to be plane travel, for example, and plane travel is this incredible ability to close that distance. But the thing about it is that you get on a plane and you travel somewhere and then you are there physically to experience it. Whereas the default mode now is what you and I are doing, which is on a computer via the internet, which is a perceived closing of distance overlaid onto a very real distance, right? You and I are very distant from one another.
Exactly.
And that matters, right? Because it sort of renders what I think of as a pretty shaky to begin with, this notion of you should care because it's going to happen to you. That was shaky to begin with, and it renders it even shakier because there is in our default mode of communication a very real distance that we're only sort of performatively closing. And so for me, that book, What Strange Paradise, I think is part of my transition from thinking of, hey, you should care about this injustice to the other because one day you will become the other, over to, no, you should care about the injustice to the other because that damage is happening to you right now. As it is destroying this person's life, it is destroying your conscience and it's destroying your soul. And so there is no distance. And so that's how I think of that book in terms of how it exists on that continuum of distance from the other and the suffering of the other. But these are very high-minded things that I can think of after the fact. When I'm writing this book, I'm not thinking about any of this.
But also the children are children. Like you don't do that thing where sometimes the children are 40-year-olds hidden in children's bodies. And you're like, oh, no, actually, I was not that witty at 40. And why are we pretending this 8-year-old is? They're actually children. And I think we need that freedom in a lot of ways for it to be children to take us through this particular story. And I will say the ending still knocks me on my heels. And again, this is the second time I'd read it, and and I understand, and it's organic, and it is true to the story, and it could have ended no other way, still knocks me on my heels. And again, it feels like it's of a piece when I look at sort of the trajectory of Sarat, and even her siblings, right? watching the evolution and also who gets to evolve, right? Like who actually gets to become an adult and how is still kind of shocking stuff.
Yeah, I think of the hundreds of book clubs that I've done over the years, the thing I get yelled about the most is the ending of What Strange Paradise. That still is. And to this day, if you start Googling, What Strange Paradise, the autocomplete, one of the first ones that comes up is, did you mean What Strange Paradise ending explained? So it's one of those things that the first 4 people to read the manuscript had 4 entirely different interpretations of what was happening. And that's when I knew that I was in for a similar ride to American War, actually, which has been read because it came out 4 months into the Trump administration, has been read as a very different book than the one I was trying to write. And that used to be very frustrating for me, and now I find it deeply comforting. I like the idea that these things that are going to outlive me, that they should have as many different lives as possible. I take great solace in that because, on this podcast, I can tell you my intent. I'm not around to tell all readers my intent at any given moment. So I like that they should go out into the world and sort of diffuse into all of these different interpretations.
But that's the power of a book, right? Like we all bring our own experience to, not every one of us is going to respond to the same thing in the same way. I mean, I need a beautiful sentence. I will own it. I'm okay maybe if stuff doesn't happen as much, but please, I cannot really, ugly sentences are not a thing I love. I can read them. I can do the thing, sure, but I need a little bit of poetry. I need a sharp insight. I need a little bit of a raised eyebrow. I need all of the things that you get in real life, only not at the same time, because all of us have like slow response mechanisms sometimes. And, you think of that line 7 years after you should have said it. And I'm like, oh, I really do. So I want to talk about language for a second because your Canadian is great. But I mean, in all honesty, you were born in Egypt, you were raised in Qatar, but English was sort of the language of the Middle East and Asia for a really long time. And other parts of the world too, obviously, but we're obviously going to use the Middle East in this case. You started learning to speak English when you were 5. It was your primary language, right?
From the age of 5, my parents moved to Qatar. I moved to Qatar, and Qatar is 90% non-Qatari. And generally speaking, if you are in the middle class on up, you send your kids to the British school, the American school. This was in the 80s and 90s. I went back last November. There's now like the Italian school and the whatever, and part of it I think is the unspoken, sometimes spoken commitment to learning the winner's language and learning the language that'll help your kids navigate the power centers of the world and all the rest of that. And like, as depressing as it is to say, I can't lie to you, like it's been incredibly rewarding to have learned, like, and I don't mean that in a personal sense. I mean that in the sense that like I got these book deals and I have less trouble going across the border because I sound like I'm from here and all of what's harder to sort of pin down and to think about is the negative space of that little achievement of mine, right? Which is how much of my own culture I basically jettisoned because I did become convinced that this was the winner's language and this was the winner's way of doing things and so on and so forth. So in very real terms, I have abandoned a huge part of myself and a huge part of my root system in exchange for whatever it is I am. And what it is I am has been rewarded quite handsomely for that.
But does it make you chase the language in a way where you are looking for precision and in some cases have to figure out, I mean, in some ways you're still living in translation, right? Like, aren't any of us, going back to what you said sort of at the top of the show where we have this separation, right? And I'm going to use book characters as an example, and so to not make you feel like we're having a therapy session. But this idea that there is the piece that you know to be true and the thing that you believe, right? it is kind of like having to translate yourself, right? Like your people, your true family are the people you don't have to translate yourself for.
Yeah.
And sometimes you still have to translate yourself for the people that you share DNA with. That's just a pain. But this idea where a novelist, a journalist, an essayist, you are constantly living in translation because you're taking this experience, right? Whether it's made up or whether it's sitting right in front of you or whether you're just interpreting, you're translating an experience and hoping that someone else can get something from it. In some ways, it's a great way to live, and in some ways, it's a really weird way to live.
Yeah, I can't disagree with a word you said. I think all writers are translators, but only translators are good translators. Writers are effectively, by definition, horrible translators. We move through the world translating experience into story. And the way I think is quite narrative. I tend to think in metaphor, analogy, storytelling as the default means of engaging another human being. If I want to explain something to you, I could try to explain it directly, knowing full well I'm going to fail miserably, or I could try to find a story that gets to what I'm trying to say. And I always opt for the latter. So there's that layer of just the work we do is very much based in a kind of literal and metaphorical translation. But then on top of that, when you're thinking in multiple languages, as I quite often do, for example, I find that when I get really stressed out, I switch to Arabic. And so most of my swearing, for example, is done in Arabic. Last November, I was back in Qatar for the first extended stretch in 20 years or so.
Oh, wow.
And I found myself comfortable in my own skin for the first time in a very long time, not because of the place, but because, I'm driving around with an old high school friend, and we naturally fall into that weird mix of Arabic and English and Qatari curse words from the 90s that if you didn't grow up there, you would never. And it just happens to be the room temperature language for me.
Yeah.
The language in which I don't feel too hot or too cold. But the other thing it does when you think that way is it makes you much more attuned to trickery as a narrative device.
Yeah.
You can hide things in the space between languages, particularly in Arab literary traditions in the last 50, 60, 70 years. There's been a necessity to hide things because there's an authoritarian government most of the time. And if you say the thing outright, you might get disappeared the next day. And so you look at the work of everyone from Naguib Mahfouz to Basma Abdelaziz, and there's trickery there. And some of that is linguistic, some of it is metaphorical. So I steal a lot of that. And it makes it easier to hide these things. And there's so many of them hidden in What Strange Paradise in particular that hardly anybody talks to me about because, again, the number of people who were born in Egypt and then grew up in Qatar and then moved to Canada at 16 and now live on the west coast of the US, it's a very small Venn diagram.
Right.
So I can get away with hiding it even though I don't have the talent of the writers I just listed. But I can pull from the same bag of tricks.
But I think you also have to have an eye for detail. I mean, certainly as a journalist, right? You've got to find that thing where you can drop it into single line and have it explained. I know you just explained about M-copy for folks who didn't understand, but you really have to be able to. Sometimes you get a subhead and it's 6 words, and you're lucky if you got 6 words. So you have to be able to find the thing that speaks the truth as quickly as possible.
I think purely from a craft perspective, this is the thing I'm fixated on so much that it becomes a problem sometimes, in the sense that, for example, with dialogue, you're thinking of that economy. And obviously, you've now spoken to me for the better part of an hour. You know that economy is not my strong suit. So how do I do that? Because sometimes people ramble in conversation. Sometimes conversation is boring. So do you give people the boring dialogue that's realistic? Or do you make it super efficient to the point where it feels like no human being could have possibly said these words in this order, except if you were trying to get to a narrative purpose? And so you can see that. You can see that in What Strange Paradise, for example. There's places where it's clear I'm working backwards from a thing I need a person to say. And so you can see the other character kind of slow pitching the softball to them so that they can hit it out of the park in a particular way. Like, that's a real I don't think it's unique to me, but I see it in my own writing quite a bit, where that economy of phrasing and that economy of emotional vectors becomes too economical. Whereas someone like Denis Johnson, for example, can get you that, can get you both somehow. And I don't know how he does it, but he does.
I'm not sure Denis Johnson knew how he did it. Honestly, and then you get Tree of Life and you're like, how did we get from Jesus' son and angels to, and I'm delighted we got there. And I've read every single word ever, but at the same time, I'm not entirely sure how we got to Tree of Life. And listen, having read you multiple times now, I think you're worried about the seams showing more than they actually do.
That's never going away, though.
No, I understand that, but I'm a pretty close reader. But it does bring us to the new book, which is different. It is part metaphor. It is part essay. It is not a polemic. It does have a very distinct point of view, and it started with a tweet. And I think we start there because if we're talking about language, 140 characters is, there's a lot.
Yeah, in late October of 2023, I was watching the slaughter in Gaza, and I posted this thing. I wasn't much of a social media person back then.
Right.
I've now left all of it behind, so effectively. I don't do any of it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But I basically posted something about how, one day when it's too late to do anything about this, everyone will have always been against it. And for some reason, this tweet gained traction. Mm-hmm. Independent of that, I was working on what ended up being this book.
Okay.
And the original title was actually The Glass Coffin. Mm-hmm. I was thinking about this idea that when you're on the receiving end of injustice of such a great magnitude, that one of the most dangerous things you can do is just show the body, just show the thing.
Right.
And so it was only after the first or second draft that somebody at Penguin Random House suggested that I repurpose the line from the tweet. And so that's what we did. And I'm grateful to them because I think it fits the book perfectly. But it has given many people the impression that I've taken a tweet and sort of stretched it out to 200 pages, which I promise you was not what happened.
No, and having read it a couple of times, I can promise that isn't what has happened as well. But I think it's interesting, too, that when we look at the entire body of work, right, between your journalism, which is its own very specific art, and the novels, and then this book, the new book feels like it is not something that could have been fictionalized. Like American War, you're doing a lot. Fiction gives you the freedom to talk about all of the things that need to be discussed in ways they need to be discussed that people might not be able to hear otherwise, right? This is all based in some ways in reporting that you've been doing. And then again, the migrant crisis with What Strange Paradise. When we look at how that works out, and now obviously we have the new book in Gaza, and the idea that you have to flip between genre, and I think it's fair to say genre, right? Essays are their own. I love a great essay. What can I say? But to get the language to do what you need it to do and connect in the way you need it to connect. And I feel like this book was written very quickly, but it sounds like, too, you started it before I knew it existed.
Yeah, it was a pretty furious writing process in the sense that we're talking about, every day for months on end. It's the only thing I could write about. Sitting there for hours and hours and hours. And that's not necessarily a good thing. It's not necessarily a good thing to be that obsessed and that angry and also trying to produce something like this. But it was all I could think about. One of the interesting things just conceptually for me is the symmetry of expectation versus intent that exists. For example, a lot of people will talk about this book as the sort of Israel-Palestine book. And quite often I would say, well, I did write an Israel-Palestine book. It was called American War, and nobody has ever read it that way in this part of the world and I get that, right? Whereas this book, this new one, I think of very much as a book about here. It's a book about the West. That's what I was autopsying. I think generally speaking, because of the part of the world I come from, mm-hmm. and in particular because of the governments that run that mm-hmm. part of the world, I have an almost sort of allergic reaction to fraudulent narrative. And the narrative feels like it's fundamentally broken, but I'm asked to believe in it anyway. I just have a very, very bad reaction to that. Because I grew up in a world where there was nothing but that. There was nothing but, every year it would rain maybe once in Qatar a year if you were very, very lucky, sort of thing. And no matter when it rained, the first item on the news that night would be thanking the emir for having done the rain prayer, which was the reason we were getting it. You're sitting there and you're just like, a narrative is being presented to me. and I realized my life would be a lot easier if I just went with it, and I can't. And I think a lot of this new book, which has it goes without saying almost, has gotten the most intense responses of anything I've ever written. The journalism, the novels, the short stories, nothing compares to the amount of love and the amount of hatred I've gotten over this book. But I think the one thing that ties it to all of the other work is that it is born of that allergic reaction to what at least and I'm not expecting you to agree with me or anybody else, but at least I perceive as a fraudulent narrative that my life would be much easier if I just went along with, and I've decided not to, and this is sort of the result of that.
But you also covered the Arab Spring. And I think a lot of us from the West were looking at that moment in history thinking, oh, this is monumental. This is world changing. I mean, we felt the same way when we saw Tiananmen Square. And some of us even remember when, the Berlin Wall fell. And all of these global markers, right, where you thought, oh, this is it. This is the moment. Something's happened. And then the change gets clawed back. And you and I are of a similar generation where we were raised to believe that, the West is the solution for everything, right? And having lots of conversations about the Vietnam War recently. And I'm like, so let's look at the legacy of Vietnam and where it got us. And it's trippy because when I was coming through college, all of the young men were studying Vietnam. And now I'm just like, so this war they called the Vietnam War yet? And it's kind of, it's really, the passage of time is a very strange thing sometimes. I think, you toss around the name McGeorge Bundy and there are people who are like, what? Who? Like, so this dude who's the architect of the Vietnam War. I'm not making light of any of this. It's just, everything is sort of like, it's these cycles of world history, right? We seem to keep folding back on ourselves. It just, the location moves.
I mean, yeah, I think, again, I think I agree with all of that. I every now and then, because of the kind of stuff I write about, I'll be asked, so what's the best book for me to read to understand what the US did in Iraq or Afghanistan? And I would often say A Bright Shining Lie by Neil Sheehan, which came out 30 or 40 years before any of this stuff happened, and is a dissection of how everything went to hell in Vietnam for the US, but is, to my mind at least, the most penetrating account of a particular facet of the American psyche that it is very difficult to address or even acknowledge in this country. And so, yes, absolutely, these cycles repeat themselves. And one of the interesting things to me about moments such as the collapse of South African apartheid, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, is that you realize that you're living through this incredibly cataclysmic moment where, figuratively or quite literally, a wall is coming down, but you're also coming to the realization that most of the people around you knew that this was wrong and are happy to go with it now because the thing is happening. Somebody else had to do that work to get them there. And this idea of the tragedy of a functioning moral compass in what is otherwise a vacuum has always struck me as a really fascinating aspect of the human condition. That deep down, almost all of us are walking around fully cognizant of what's right and what's wrong. And again, we go back to this idea of the distance, the gap, the dissociation between what I understand on a core moral level and what I'm willing to do or even acknowledge publicly, and how easy it is for me to fit those two very distant versions of myself into the same costume and into the same body. I think a lot of that shows up in the whatever is incendiary about the new book, I think comes from that place.
I have a line from Hanif Abdurraqib's last book tattooed on my arm. And it says, "Nostalgia is a relentless hustler."
I like that.
And I do feel Hanif is a genius. Hanif Abdurraqib is an absolute genius. But it goes back to everything. It goes back to why I read. It goes back to why I read across genre. I read fiction. I read nonfiction. I cannot stay away from history. I was actually a history major, which is kind of how you end up being a bookseller, I suppose. But this idea that we keep walking ourselves back to where we've been before, and we don't actually know what that necessarily looks like or how to translate that for ourselves, I think is. I think books are really great in that regard. I think they can help us in a lot of ways to expand our understanding. I mean, years ago there was that study that said, "Hey, reading fiction builds your empathy muscle." Like, I would like to see that. That would be cool. Could we do more of that? But I will say, Omar, I think you and I could keep going for a really long time. And I am going to say thank you so much for joining us on Port Over. This was exactly the conversation I needed today, so thank you.
Well, this was a privilege. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.